Hello there, I'm Taylor Treed. Welcome back to another Treed Reads video. I really enjoyed the top 5 science fiction books I'd recommend for getting into the genre, so today I thought I'd do the same thing with fantasy. I plan on concentrating primarily on sci-fi and fantasy on this channel. Of course, I'll do other genres too, but in terms of what I read, that's my main focus, so it felt incomplete to do sci-fi but not fantasy. Today I have 5 more books for you to check out if you want to get into fantasy or if you want to try something new. It's important to note that as in the last video and every video I do, some of these authors may have controversial opinions. I am in no way aligning myself with them or their ideas by talking about their books. I encourage you to read any book with a critical lens as I do. And if you don't want to support a particular author but are interested in their book, I would definitely encourage you to get it secondhand. I'm starting off with an absolute classic. It's The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. If you've seen The Lord of the Rings, you know Tolkien. He wrote the Lord of the Rings series. The Hobbit is sort of a prequel to those, but it stands alone. That's why I'm putting it on this list instead of any of the Lord of the Rings books, because it's a self-contained adventure. If you love the world, you can keep going with The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and continued writings. But The Hobbit is a wonderfully cozy but also very adventurous high fantasy adventure. That's a great place to start with fantasy. Now, what does high fantasy mean? The way I understand it, high fantasy is a world that's not really our world, it's a separate thing. Low fantasy is a world that is our world but with more fantastical elements added to it. So The Hobbit gives you the full high fantasy experience. Different world, dragons, magic, totally different rules, and like elves, dwarves, the whole 9 yards. The characters are wonderful, the prose is easily accessible, it's fun, it's funny. It's both lighthearted and very serious simultaneously. The thing that I think is wonderful about The Hobbit is that it is as high stakes as you make it. If you really get into it and you really care a ton about what's going on and you get very invested in their journey, it could be a very intense, like high energy book. If you get more into the setting and wondering about the world, it could be more fantastical and kind of fun. Tolkien was a linguist. If you want to get into the language of it, you could have a very academic experience with the text. The Hobbit, in my mind, is in the running for the single best place to get into fantasy, primarily because it does that beautiful thing of giving you exactly what you want out of the story. I think it can appeal to people across a variety of different reading preferences, and if you don't read, if you've not read anything since like high school, I think it's a wonderful way to get back in it. It is very accessible, very exciting, the pacing is really fun. So it's just a wonderful book to get started. I didn't even tell you what The Hobbit is about, I'm so sorry. Bilbo Baggins is living in the Shire, he's a hobbit, he is friends with a wizard named Gandalf. He's visited by all these crazy cool dwarves and they go on a wonderful adventure. The aim of the quest is to recover some gold that the dwarves are sort of owed because of family ties. There is a lot that happens, there are elves, there are trolls, it's wild. There's a dragon, I think the dragon's kind of a critical part. It is a beautiful, wild, high fantasy story. It sets the tone for pretty much everything else you'll read in fantasy. For number 2, we have Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. Sanderson is a huge name in fantasy. If you know anything about the genre, you've probably heard his name. If you haven't, prepare to hear it a lot more. Mistborn, in my humble opinion, is the best place to start with any of his books, and it's a wonderful book to start with if you're getting into fantasy. I've heard it said that it's a great place to get into the genre if you've been reading young adult fiction. That does make sense to me because whereas some fantasy books are wildly complicated, The Way of Kings is another book by Brandon Sanderson. It has a lot of names, a lot of places, different countries, different sort of like human subspecies, which is wild. There's a lot to keep in your head in one book. Mistborn has less. It's focused on one place and a not small, but definitely not giant cast of characters. YA books to me are characterized by relatively quick, dynamic plots, a solid, strong cast of characters that's not too expansive, and a setting that is easily digested by people who are teenagers, who are younger. Mistborn does have those elements, but it takes it to a different level. I think those aspects that make it a great place to get into fantasy from YA fantasy also make it a great place to get into fantasy for non-fantasy readers. Not having to manage tons of different continents and people and all kinds of crazy magic is very helpful. That's not to say that Mistborn doesn't have its complications. Brandon Sanderson is known for his extraordinarily well thought out and intricate magic systems. Mistborn's magic is awesome. It's so cool. It's a little bit complex, there's a lot to keep in your head, but it introduces it gradually, and Brandon Sanderson is wonderful at reminding you when you need to be reminded about what's going on and how it works. Other books in fantasy will kind of throw you into the deep end, and you just have to keep it all in your head and roll with it. Some books are infamous for doing that, in sci-fi and fantasy. Examples would be like Blindsight and Book of the New Sun. Crazy, crazy stories, very cool, but a lot to keep in your head. Brandon Sanderson is amazing at explaining himself without info dumping, which is critical to enjoying the text. Mistborn is about a girl named Vin, and she lives somewhere called the Last Empire. So basically the setting of Mistborn, and this is not a spoiler, is what if the bad guy already won? There is an ensemble cast, there's a master-apprentice plot between a character called Kelsier and Vin. The main plot is actually a heist on this guy, the Lord Ruler, who is the bad guy who won. It is so much bigger than that. You'll see it if if you continue with the Mistborn books. There are 3 of them. The pacing is amazing, the characters are wildly dynamic. The only real critique that I have for any of the Mistborn books, all 3 actually, is that sometimes things get a bit repetitive. Brandon Sanderson explains things multiple times and is very clear about what's going on. If you're used to reading more abstract, more obscure books, that can get a little bit annoying. I went to Brandon Sanderson from, what did I read before that? Hyperion Cantos. So I was reading like very wild, intense science fiction that's a little bit obscure, that's hard to understand. And so reading Mistborn at first, I was like, this is so obvious to me, like the characterization that's going on, the magic system, whatever. But if I'd come to it from nonfiction, for example, I would have been so grateful for that. So that is the one thing I'd be aware of going into it if you're coming from like more intense sci-fi or fantasy background, but it does not make it any worse of a book. It's a wonderful book, the characters are incredible, and the series takes it to new heights that I didn't even think were going to happen. As a bonus, if you like Sanderson and you like his work, all of his books are in the same universe. It's called the Cosmere, actually not all of them. Some of them are all in the Cosmere. It's the majority. So if you like Mistborn, there are 7 Mistborn books. There's a trilogy, and then there's an additional 4-book series that comes after it that is further along in the timeline. There are going to be 2 or 3 more trilogies/series that come out in the Mistborn world. There's Elantris, there's Warbreaker, there is the Stormlight Archive, there are a ton of short stories, there's White Sands, there are multiple secret projects. What else is coming out? Dragonsteel series. There's going to be 10 total Stormlight Archive books, I think. A lot of these have short stories that go with them as well. There's more sequels to Elantris and Warbreaker coming out apparently. I don't know, it's too much to keep track of. The Cosmere is massive. It's wonderful, it reveals itself to you gradually, and Mistborn is a great entry point into a huge universe if you want to read all of that. I'm getting ahead of myself, the Cosmere is a big project, but again, if you like the Cosmere, this is another good point, you might want to dive into other big series. The Cosmere is great because you can jump between parts of it and have a more self-contained story, but still get a bigger story as well. There are series like The Wheel of Time that are just huge, and if you like a lot of books, maybe you go in that direction. Number 3 is a very fun one. It is Mort by Terry Pratchett. Terry Pratchett's Discworld novels are some of the coolest in fantasy. They're all related. If you hear people say it's a series, they're kind of right. It's almost episodic, like a lot of characters interplay between different books. The setting is the same. That's a really, really cool world on the back of 4 elephants who I think are also on the back of a turtle. And it's crazy. It's a Discworld that is resting on these animals. Mort is about death. And it's about if Death took on an apprentice because he wanted to retire. Mort is the name of the apprentice. If you speak French, you know that's funny because Mort is death in French. Basically, this guy Mort starts interning for Death. And Death wants to get out of the profession. And it's really funny to sort of see Death try to be like more of a normal dude, and Mort be kind of like a weird little freaky guy and start being Death. It is a crazy story. There's actually more conflict to it. There are bigger stakes. There's some politics, which is really interesting. And the whole thing is about mortality, and magic. And it's really, really fun. It's really silly. I was laughing out loud reading this book, which is a rare thing for me. I've read multiple Discworld novels, and I think this is my absolute favorite. It has to be. The beauty of starting here with Mort is that it's funny, it's fun, it's engaging, it's really easy to read. I think it's only a couple hundred pages. So it's a relatively low stakes investment into fantasy reading and into the Discworld series if you're interested in the bigger series. The other wonderful thing about that with Discworld is you can start with Mort and go anywhere in the series comfortably and it'll all make sense. If you start with Pratchett, that is a wonderful way to get into fantasy. You can go so many other directions based on what you like and don't like. This book has wonderful insights and themes about life too. It's not all just silly. It is all very silly. But it hits hard too. It has a lot of messages that have stuck with me over the years. So I highly recommend it. Next, we're moving to an author that is associated with Terry Pratchett, but it's a much darker book. It's American Gods by Neil Gaiman. If you ever read any of the Percy Jackson books, you're gonna love this book. If you've never read Percy Jackson, you'll still probably love it. American Gods is about a dude who gets caught up in this crazy conflict between the new gods and the old gods. The old gods are the gods of the mythologies you already know, Greek, Norse, Roman, all of that. The new gods are gods of society as it is today. There's technology, I think desire/lust is another one. It's a book about the power of myth and the importance of myth and religion to society, and it's a really interesting commentary on the way that we worship the things that are important to society at any given time. This is a wonderful example of low fantasy. It's based in our world, it has fantastical elements that are magical, that are mythological. It's very, very cool, but it definitely is based here. And that has a very different tone than high fantasy, which is set elsewhere. Not all low low fantasy is dark. I wouldn't say this is dark fantasy. It definitely has darker elements. It's very gritty and real at times. The wonder of American Gods to me is that it deals with mythology and it has a lot of different subgenres within it. Mythology to me is its own subgenre in a lot of other genres. Things like Dune are heavily influenced by religion and mythology, and a lot of other books are as well. So if you love the mythological elements of American Gods, you can take that and run off to different books that have similar things or similar inspirations. Joseph Campbell argued that all stories are the monomyth, like the hero's journey. This book has a lot of that, so if you like that story archetype, you can take that and run with that as well. It also has a lot of different genres. It has mystery, it has borderline horror, it has a lot of action, it has a lot of intrigue and thriller aspects, but it does also have humor. It's very entertaining, and it's very dynamic and well-paced. So if you want a more low fantasy book, something that's a bit closer to reality, that is going to take you through a fascinating journey with historical and mythological influences and a lot of different subgenres packed in really cool ways, this is a great place to start. The final book on this list is the only book I will have talked about on this channel so far that I haven't actually finished. However, the strength of the book so far has brought it here. It is Babble by R.F. Kuang. Babble is low fantasy. It's set on Earth. There are actually very few alterations to our world aside from the magic system and a tower in the School of Oxford, Babble, for language translation. The plot is that a young boy from China goes over to study in Oxford. The circumstances of that are part of the plot, so I'll leave that to you. This boy, Robin, goes to learn about the art of translation, which feeds into the magic system. But there's this conflict around the British Empire and its exploitation and domination of the world, and China, which is kind of a rival power. The interesting thing is that he has an identity that sort of spans both of these places, and it's about his internal conflict and the conflict in the world as a whole. This book, I think more than the others, has a real-life impact, because it's about the lived experience of someone from one culture living in another. As a white dude living in America, that's been really insightful for me to read and learn a little bit more about. Of course, it's fiction, it's fantasy, it doesn't just concern that, but that is a through line in the book, and it's a really important perspective to at least try to understand. Reading ultimately is about understanding the lives, perspectives, ideas of other people. This book does an extraordinary job of presenting that. So if you're coming from more realistic, impactful literary fiction or non-fiction, things that concern the real world, this is a little bit more grounded of a fantasy book. Reading this book will let you sort of see if you want to go with the more fantastical elements or a different direction. Even if you already really love crazy high fantasy, this book I think is extraordinary and worth reading. I very rarely found a book that is, one, this good, but two, blends fantasy, historical fiction, political plots, all these different things together so well. Bonus points if you're into etymology like me, that is the study of the origins and evolution of words, because there's some really cool writing in here about words and translation and language. So if you're interested in any of that, you're gonna love this. Those are my top 5 fantasy books for getting into the genre. I think they cover a really good range. You have everything from some historically influenced low fantasy to totally out there high fantasy. By reading one or multiple or all of these books, I think you'll be able to get a really good idea of what you like and don't like in fantasy. You also might get exposed to new series or authors that you want to explore more. Let me know if you think I missed any important books. Let me know if you think any of those books shouldn't be on the list. I would happily make a part 2 to this video talking about more books, and even discussing these books a little bit more if necessary. In any event, thank you for being here. I hope if you read any of those that you enjoy the experience. As always, have a great day and happy reading.